both a great honor and an immense pleasure to have Professor Conway Morris kicking off our first meeting of the term. Many of you will be familiar with our eminent speaker, but I'll just mention a couple of his works: The Crucible of Creation, The Life Solution, and The Roots of Evolution, which I think are among your earthwork. Those works are probably most relevant exactly to the interests of the seminar and possibly of relevance to your talk this evening.
Could be. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for making time. Right, okay. I won't stand, I can just. I haven't had a drink yet. My background, as you'll quickly realise, I'm neither a philosopher nor a theologian. I've got interests in both, but I'm certainly not competent to defend my views. This is by way of a whole series of apologies, which is the senior academics are pretty good at these days. You're always sorry about something. So I'm technically an evolutionary biologist. As it happens, I'm Christian, but that's actually, I don't think, immediately material for what I want to try and say. And if I may, I'll give you a bit of background if it's of interest. I came to Cambridge years ago, 72 in fact, which you can then guess what my age is, because you're not allowed to say how old you are anymore. It's all forbidden. That's strange. I'm 119. And I was very lucky to start work on a famous fossil deposit, famous that is amongst paleontologists, called the Burgess Shale, which has got this exquisitely preserved material. And to cut long story short, at that time, which was explained far more eloquently by Stephen Jay Gould, we were both of the opinion that such was the diversity of forms in the Burgess Shale, that were we to end up in the counterfactual world, and I might come back to that later on, then the likelihood of anything like a human being here was vanishingly small. And this very much fits into the general trope of randomness in evolution and other things like mass extinctions, which radically redirect the course of evolution. Well, don't tell anybody, they don't. That's another story. Actually, they're deeply creative as it happens. But again, this comes up in conversation. So that's all fine and large. And then, as the years progressed, it dawned on me that in point of fact, this view of the sort of undetermined nature of evolutionary processes was, despite its being almost entirely accepted by everybody, I think, was unlikely to be correct. And this was principally resulting from a growing interest in what we call evolutionary convergence, which, as I mentioned not so long ago in a review of somebody else's book on this topic, is becoming much too popular. And this is just warning, especially to younger people, I may say, if something gets popular, get out of the field as quickly as possible. There's no point hanging around, none whatsoever. And the point about this is a convergence, and the classic example would be the similarities between the camera eye we possess and that of an octopus. And we can show beyond reasonable doubt that our common ancestor would not have possessed such a complex organ. And as you probably know, Darwin agonized about this, and I think a rather misleading way, but that's another story. But effectively, the number of endpoints in the evolutionary process is vanishingly small in comparison to what is the potential number of endpoints, which is stupidly large. And I think we can make quite a good argument that in an unremarkable way, from the point of Darwinian adaptation, it shouldn't really be any great surprise. So I could give you endless examples of evolutionary convergence, but I hope you'll accept that it's effectively ubiquitous. So if you don't, that's fine. We can defend this area with equal pleasure, of course. Now, this has two consequences, if correct. The first, of course, is that if indeed the likelihood of something like a human evolving on a like planet would have to be inevitable, but even so, very much on the cards, then there should be across the universe, and of course most locally our galaxy, a very large number of extraterrestrial civilizations. And the snag here is that although we know there are a very large number of so-called extrasolar planets, stupidly large number, many of them are significantly older than our solar system. Our solar system is about 4.6 billion years. Other solar systems are maybe 2-3 billion years older than that. So in principle, they should have a head start. And in principle, we shouldn't be here. In fact, we have been turned into a zoo or eaten or something like that. And this revolves around a second question to do with the nature of extraterrestrial civilizations, and that is nobody's ever found one, and there's no immediate prospect of that happening either. And this devolves into what's called the Fermi paradox, which is articulated by the Italian physicist Enrico Fermi. And again, this is extremely interesting because it actually, I think, in the end has some theological consequences to it, but also from a scientific viewpoint, what I say today, we have no evidence for extraterrestrial signals or visitations or anything, could be completely wrong tomorrow. So we keep an open mind in these areas, but along with the observation there are much older solar systems than ours, there is some cause for concern. In fact, David Brin, as a scientist and science fiction writer, referred to this apparent absence as, quote, the great silence. So that rings a bell, you know, if you're a decent monk, you know where we are on that one. Then the other aspect about convergence, of course, was that not everything's trying to be the same, but even so, in terms of human-like characters, the development of a large brain is something which is pretty common. And this is known as encephalization, so we can look at dolphins or crows, and these have some measure of intelligence as well. So that's fine and large. We see that although brains are expensive in terms of their metabolic maintenance, nevertheless, they are the sorts of things which can evolve. By the way, they don't always have to go that direction. You can miniaturize brains as well and do all sorts of other clever things. And in terms of the Darwinian explanation, there are perfectly good ways of explaining these sorts of things. So again, don't think that everything is on a monotonic railroad to one place. So that's all fine and large, and so convergence suggests there's optimism in the likelihood of something like ourselves evolving, and the fact that we have friends around on our planet which seem to be going in much the same way is perhaps additional evidence. And then, of course, we run into a problem, and that is that humans are unique. You know, we're clearly of evolutionary descent from a primate, something approximately like a chimpanzee, and so we have the evolutionary continuity, which I think is unarguable. Not everybody necessarily agrees with that. Yet, despite that, we have ourselves now, which are, for all intents and purposes, I wrote somewhere else, we might as well be parachuted onto the planet. And there are two problems about this. First of all, what I'm now going to say is going to go entirely against the zeitgeist of received wisdom, especially in sciences, which insists on the evolutionary continuity of form and by implication also mental states. How else could it possibly be? The problem also, of course, is that we are the very worst people to study ourselves. It's impossible to get out of yourself, of course. And I know, and it might come out in a conversation, but the ability to actually, you know, look at oneself independently is impossible. You know, we can try, and of course we go to theatre to do that, but that's a nice different story. So here we have this problem that maybe it's simply a genetic difference, or whatever, or maybe it's because we had sufficiently large social groups, as Robin Dunbar has argued, which means that we then had to change our behaviour, if you like, so that we had to understand not only uncles and cousins, but other people who were much more distantly related to us and might or might not be people with which we should perhaps interbreed or not interbreed, and that sort of thing. But I don't think any of those explanations myself work for a moment at all. So the question then is, how might we begin to explain this? And as I said, I'm a scientist, not a philosopher of any sort of description. But a couple of things worth noticing. Of course, here I'm not really a very good witness because, as you will all know, the last 3 years we have been following the science, so to speak, in terms of the COVID pandemic. And I'm not going to go on about this for too long, otherwise it will turn simply into a 40-minute rant. But the fact of the matter is that, in my opinion, we have been grievously misinformed. And even to say that there was a science we followed as an open-minded scientist is suspicious. And there are other questions about where science is going and who's funding it and various other things. And of course, you can enter fields of paranoia quite quickly if you so wish. But I think there's actually serious reasons to be concerned at the moment about the way the science is funded and the way that science is being pursued. And areas that receive wisdom receive funding. Areas which perhaps question that tend not to receive funding. And that may be because the areas which are not acceptable are wrong, but science is never certain that things are right. Discuss. Now, when it comes to animal behavior, this turns out to be extremely interesting. And in fact, there was I didn't bring the references with me, but an essay I was reading quite recently, which is unpublished, it's on the so-called archive rather than in a peer-reviewed journal, But what they point out are a number of very interesting things about, especially the area of animal behavior. First of all, it's very expensive. So, maintaining these creatures is not simple. And there are all sorts of ethical questions which surround this now. And in fact, I think the centre out at Madingley was closed quite recently, not because anything was wrong there, but, they decided that actually it was just too expensive to run. But more importantly, there are associated problems. And the first of them is a general problem in science, which is talked about when people have had 3 gin and tonics, but almost never beforehand. And that is sort of a question of replicability. You do, in theory, you do the same experiment again and again. You use copper sulfate, and it does it invariably. You don't have to worry about that. But when it comes to animal behavior in particular, it's sometimes extremely difficult to get the same experiment to work in the same way. And part of the reason might be is that the animals in question actually are not identical. Some are fairly bright, some are fairly stupid. So, you have to be aware that you may not have a level playing field to start with. But much more serious, I think, are 2 things. First of all, the problem is that articles which show something like a human-like behavior, however tenuous, are accepted. But anything which doesn't show that, which is effectively a negative result, is never mentioned at all. So the whole field is extremely biased to just demonstrating things which are more like us than are different from ourselves, because that's where the funding goes. And then the other problem about this is that again and again, I'll give you one example in a few minutes if I may, what appeared to be a knockdown demonstration of some capacity of an animal, group of animals, to do something which appeared to be akin to what humans do themselves, in particular things which appeared to have some bearing on the so-called theory of mind, the idea that you can actually understand what's going on inside somebody else's skull. These knockdown experiments repeatedly over the years are demolished. That's absolutely perfect because this is science, and that's exactly what we want. We want something which is apparently absolutely correct. So you might think, for instance, of some future time when the Big Bang explanation turns out, in fact, to be totally wrong. Is it possible for us to see how that might be the case? But any scientist will admit that, strong as the evidence may be, it can always be revised in one form or a fashion. So we have this problem in dealing with animals that they are difficult. And although there is scientific explanations, you need to look at the fine print quite carefully, and I'll come back to that in a second. Now, what I'm going to do now is, from an outside point of view, appear to be nothing but a demolition. I'm going to show you all the things animals don't do. And I need to stress straight away that this is in no sense a negative on that somehow these animals are stupid or not worth our attention, or that we can deal with them as we wish and experiment with them as we wish. Emphatically, none of that is correct at all. I'm not trying to talk these animals down. The point about the animals is that what they do fantastically well, and that's exactly what they're meant to do. So once again, the problem is not the animals, it's us, because we are the ones which have difficulty explaining ourselves. Let me just start, if I might, with an anecdote which I came, not what is a sort of anecdote, I came across very recently, because I'm still trying to keep up with this area. Although I'm reading some other things, including one of this young man's books from everything on imagination, which may come into conversation in due course. And this is by Bill McGrew, who's well known to primatologists. And social creatures, chimpanzees, dolphins, all those sorts of things, if they've been separated from each other for some time, and then they reunite, they greet each other effusively. They're delighted to see each other. I mean, in the case of chimpanzees, it might actually involve a sort of kissing and so forth. That's good. And it's the sort of thing when we see our friends after some time of absence. But the odd thing is that animals never, ever say farewell, ever. They never say goodbye. And that tells me something quite interesting. In a certain sense, I could almost stop my address now, because that's their problem. They have no future. And why should they? There's absolutely no reason for them to have a future. They don't need to know about futures. Day to day is quite enough for their existence. So that one, in a certain way, although I wish I'd seen this paper before I wrote my last book, in its own way, is as telling as anything I'd like to say. And now on to the demolition, if I can. And I should say, by the way, please interrupt, because there's absolutely no reason to get to the end of this talk, perhaps to your relief as well as mine. But the thing is, of course, animals, and I'll come back to this right at the end, animals don't speak. So we can't ask them to do anything. We can demonstrate. But the problem is they have to be trained. And this training is almost always absolutely exhaustive and in many cases involves tens of thousands of trials before they begin to get it right. And not only that, but very frequently, in fact, the bar of acceptance is surprisingly low. For instance, they might have to get a certain trial right 4 times in a go, even though the 5th time they don't get it right. So that again, not a criticism then, because we used to have places called circuses, and that's exactly what they did. They trained animals to do circus tricks. And I'll give you just one quick example. This is to do with a thing known as entrainment, which is to do with how you understand rhythms changing, and the thing like a metronome. And these 2 investigators were interested to know whether rhesus monkeys were capable of entraining. And for a whole year, they spent the time investigating day by day whether they could persuade the rhesus monkey to realize what that metronome was doing. They changed the pitch of the thing so that they could, get the thing. And at the end of the year, complete failure. And what does this tell us? It tells us absolutely nothing about rhesus monkeys. They're not interested in training. Why should they be? It tells us an enormous about ourselves. What other species have spent a whole year trying to train a rhesus monkey? the amount of effort going into this, and I can give you many, many such examples. So again, almost by way of introduction, one of the things which is always known but not necessarily mentioned is the phenomenon of so-called enculturation. And the example which I think is most telling is what is known as mirror self-recognition. Now, in the animal world, what you do is you anesthetize the animal gently, very gently, and you put some mark on it, which you wouldn't otherwise be able to see. And then you introduce it to a cage or whatever with a mirror, and the animal, if you're lucky, goes up and looks at it. And this is greeted always with applause, because surely the animal has some sense of self. Now, there are several problems with this. I mean, one is that many species, including my dog, is incapable. He looks in a mirror, but he never sees himself. He sees us, but he won't see himself. But it's a handful of species which really show this in a convincing fashion. But most important of all, by far, is that such animals are always enculturated. In other words, they're animals which are brought up with humans. They know humans, they know human behavior. And this is part of a general problem, in as much as when they have these famous experiments with Coco or Kanzi or IE or all the rest of them, teaching them mathematics or sign language or whatever you choose to address, all of them being intensively involved with human activities. But in the wild, never ever do you see a chimpanzee looking in a pool and resembling Narcissus. I'm a handsome chap. I can't wait to get down to the disco. No, they just don't do that. And again, there's no reason for them to do that. And when I mentioned this question of apparently knockdown observations then being revised, and again, I must stress, I'm not trying to be destructive about this. What I will eventually be going towards is what is our question of mind in general, which I think might interest some of you as well. And this is something which goes back to, and some of you may know these experiments, the so-called Aesop's fable, whereby the thirsty crow, unable to recover the water in the jar, drops stones and the water level rises, and the thirst of the crow is assuaged. So that's all very satisfactory. And for all I know, it might have been based on some real observations in ancient Greece. I couldn't possibly say. So in the case of the crows, which are famously smart, you give them a tube full of water, and you put just out of reach some food, which they can see, and you train them, and they learn fairly quickly actually to drop stones into the tube, and up goes the water, and they get the snacks. Everybody's happy about that. And at first sight, this again looks like a spectacular demonstration of the understanding of causality. You drop the stone in, I get the food. So what's there to complain about? But then what the experiments subsequently did was to make the experiments somewhat more complicated, involving a series of U-tubes and a number of tubes, some of which were connected to the tubes which are visible, other ones most certainly were not, but the connections were all invisible because they're underneath the table on which the crows sat, and hopeless. And this is not at all surprising, because effectively what these animals are doing is they're learning by trial and error. They're certainly capable of learning, they'd be in a very sorry state if they couldn't. But what they can't do ever is join the dots. They don't have any sense of causality. And once again, as a human, we just take this for granted. It's something, especially in the sciences, when the dot, and probably also in your areas, when the dots click, everything falls together, makes sense like that. So a few other things just before we hopefully have some discussion about this, is that when you go through the list of things which are human-like, near the top of the list is tool making. And sure enough, you're bound to see some chimpanzee with a stick doing termite dipping or something like that. And this, indeed, you might argue, is exactly what our immediate ancestors were doing about 6 million years ago. Ants and termites are very rich in lipids and in protein, and therefore a highly desirable food source. And if you're maintaining an extensive brain, you might as well eat ants and termites if you possibly can. But it turns out, in fact, to begin with, that there is almost no correlation between tool making per se and intelligence. The point about correlation is the sociality. So there are really smart animals, as we would regard in other contexts, which never use tools, and other ones like Darwin's finches, which are not terribly bright, but do use tools. And as much in the case of Darwin's finches and the Galapagos, they're doing this for an adaptive reason. And that's fine and makes good Darwinian sense. But even so, it's not a sort of monotonic connection between brain size and tool making. Much more importantly, even with the chimpanzees, is that they never use one tool to make another tool. They might use two tools in sequence, but they never take one tool and modify it in a way with another tool. And this is essential because as far as we're concerned, we have a cumulative technology. We use one tool to make another tool, to make another tool, to make another tool. And if you can't do that, you will never have a cumulative technology. And therefore, you will never be human. The other thing which in fact, Douglas also mentions in I think your imagination book, and this is sort of again self-evident, is that the tools which you do use, and one could refer just as easily to a potter making a pot as anything else, these are a cognitive extension of ourselves. They're not just inanimate objects. And therefore, it's not surprising, anecdotally, we often give the tools we use nicknames. You know, they become part of us. And in that way, there's no reason to think that the animals are doing anything remotely comparable to that. And of course, all of this underpins human inventiveness, which, as we know, can be stifled or restricted in various ways in particular societies. But given free rein, as has happened in various cultures over the past, and dramatically so in the United States, for instance, which is, you know, I don't know when I first went to the States, my mouth was opening and closing like this. It was absolutely incredible, totally incredible people. I mean, I'm saying not everything they do is nice and good, but even so, you have to take hat off to them. In parenthesis, when animals do use tools, such as when the female chimpanzees use rather large rocks to break open nutrient-rich nuts, the ways they do this actually vary in different parts of Africa. That's all fine and large. And this has been referred to as cultural variation. In other words, you go to one Gombe or wherever it might be, or Tay or wherever you are, where they're doing these sorts of things in a particular style. But it's been pointed out, and I think this is correct, we can certainly identify those as cultures, but there's actually no reason to think that chimpanzees themselves know that they have cultures. So once again, understandably, I mean, we look at this sort of thing and say, well, of course, you know, you go even different parts of this country, let alone anywhere else. We're well aware of all sorts of fascinating variations in what goes on, and they fascinate us, but you can be sure they do not fascinate chimpanzees. And for example, the general rule of thumb amongst chimpanzees is that the females emigrate to other tribes, and they, of course, can carry knowledge of the existing cultures with them, but they make absolutely no impact on the horde which they then join. In other words, and this, in fact, then leads on to my next point, and that is that, to begin with, animals clearly have memory, and if they didn't, they would be in a pretty poor form. And of course, famous examples, which are sometimes used to justify something analogous to human intelligence, is what the crows, the corvids in particular, do. This is a caching, where they can remember up to 10,000 different places where they've hidden seeds. And this is absolutely spectacular. But that's exactly what they need to do to get themselves through very severe winters. But there's no reason to think, so far as we can't ask them, that they actually remember the Tuesday they cached that pile over there, or the Wednesday where they cached that pile over there. This is a process which enables them to survive, but again, they have no particular need to remember in the way that we would describe as so-called episodic memory. And linked to this, and that in fact I think goes back to mirror self-recognition, enculturation, and all the rest of it. Animals can learn by observation, but never ever do they teach. And again, I think, like never saying farewell, they have no concept what a pupil is. They have no idea, most, as we know perfectly well in this university, the most terrifying thing of all is when you suddenly realize a student you're teaching is much brighter than you are and begins to gently correct you. No, Doctor, I don't think it's quite like that. I think, no, Plotinus did say that. You must remember, and there you are, very shrinking under your chair. Been outed again on this in this intellectual area. And so, again, going to the chimpanzees, in as much as they are sometimes, but not always, tool makers, where they're bashing the stones. It's mostly done by the females, and the young chimpanzee will indeed observe and then ultimately try and imitate the mother. But at no point does the female chimpanzee interfere and say, no, don't be like an idiot, look if you go on like that. And so the result of this is that just as they don't know culture, so too they can never step outside themselves. So there'll never be a theatre for animals. They can never be actors. They can never put themselves in other people's shoes. And again, there's no need for them to do that. And in a way, perhaps linked to memory, perhaps, because to us, especially my age and others, this is something which you begin to realize is not so far away. It's how do we understand death? And obviously you'll understand theologically, we're in very rich territory indeed, as you might imagine. And it's extremely clear that amongst the more intelligent of the species, especially the great apes, in comparison to some extent with the monkeys, when an animal is dying and then is dead, they understand that there's something very badly wrong here. It's not working, that they do see. But on the other hand, there's absolutely no reason at all to think that they have any conception of what we would call death. And again, from our perspective, obviously on this side of the curtain, there's an inert object on the floor which will eventually be lowered into the ground or cremated or whatever. Whereas a recurrent insistence in human cultures, whether it's completely delusional is irrelevant, is of course there's some sort of afterlife. And again, you could only possibly do that if you could see into an unimaginable future. So that again is not particularly sort of surprising. So the net result of all this is that the cognitive world of the animals is massively restricted. As I've already mentioned, they do what they need to do, but no more than that. And so all the sorts of things which we take completely for granted, although we take it too much for granted, of course, is that we think invariably in metaphors, and we rely completely on analogical thinking. And that's especially true in sciences, and I dare say it's true in your areas as well. That when you're trying to think out of the box, the first thing you do, like Einstein did, was actually sort of think, well, what would it be like if I was in that particular situation? And this also has a consequence, of course, that we are fascinated in categories and classification. Rightly or wrongly is a different question, but so far as the animal is concerned, if you think, for instance, of a mouse, it is perfectly well aware that that large furry object with teeth called a cat is an extremely dangerous object. And of course, if it's really lucky, the poor old mouse will be infected with toxoplasma, which changes its behavior. So it actually wanders out in front of the cat, but that's, a regrettable side effect of a parasite. But so far as the mouse is concerned, it doesn't matter whether it's a Burmese or a Siamese or Persian. It has no interest. It wouldn't know why these things should be. So, as an initial conclusion, it's obvious that animals understand, and they can clearly understand each other's intentions, and they obviously communicate clearly enough. But what I'm arguing, and this has been argued by many others, but not very many, is that they cannot enter into the mind of another. And to use just one quote of a animal behaviorist, they quote here, I forget her name, I'm afraid, but they know what others know, but not what they believe. So once again, so far as we're concerned, belief is in a sense central to everything we do. That leads obviously into trust or lack of trust, which goes back actually to science. And if you no longer trust your scientists or people who are claiming to represent the scientists, then you are necessarily suspicious. Now, all this is interesting, but if you ask anybody, and Eric Conway, for instance, amongst others, would agree with this, if nothing else, that the difference is that animals do not have language. If they had language, then obviously we could tell them what we'd like them to do, and they would say, aye, aye, sir, and go off and do whatever they need to do with it. Talk. They never do that. The point about animal communication is that invariably it's what we call imperative. It's basically shouting. It's more or less issuing sounds. I won't use words for a very good reason, but they don't, except in the narrowest of contexts, carry any meaning at all. And of course, it has been fashionable to imagine that amongst, especially the primates, the monkeys in particular, see, the problem is that the apes are not great vocalizers, whereas the monkeys are. And perhaps this is a bit in parenthesis, but it's only something I was reading just a couple of days ago, which I should have appreciated, and perhaps it's not quite the place to put it. But when people realized that apes weren't, and chimpanzees in particular, weren't going to be very good at speaking, they don't have the right arrangement in their vocal tracts. So it's all a bit of a waste of time. People spent a huge effort trying to get them to utter a few words. But they've realized in due course that one thing chimpanzees do extremely well is gesture. And they use these gestures to communicate. That's quite all right. Nobody's disputing any of this. So they then said, well, hang on a moment. Of course, we have in human society people who are deaf, or indeed actually want to use it for other reasons. It's not only deaf people, they use sign language. So that's fine and good. So they said, well, why don't we teach the chimpanzees sign language? And that would be a way into getting into communicating with them. But it turns out, first of all, although they make some facsimiles of sign language, and I should have been aware of this, and I apologize, but that's a great thing about reading the whole time. You learn things you didn't know 3 weeks ago. The syntactical deep structure in sign language is identical to language. You don't have to speak, it's the same thing. And in that sense, a chimpanzee is going to be no more capable of using sign language as a surrogate for what we would call language than any other method of communication. And so back to the monkeys, which are somewhat more articulate in this respect. At one stage, and the classic examples of vervet monkeys, and they have a series of words, specifically, famously, in all the textbooks, 3 words, one for eagle, one for leopard, and one for snake. Now, these are all dangerous creatures, and it's a jolly good idea to avoid them if you possibly can. But on later analysis, it turns out in point of fact that these are in no sense proto-words, not least because it has an applicability in one group of vervet monkeys, I think in Tanzania or Uganda, whereas elsewhere in Africa, they have completely different arrangements. Not only that, but more importantly, the so-called words they use do not have the precise control which we would have on in terms of conveying meaning, nor indeed is it in any sense a sort of set of synonyms which they're using to, if you like, say, well, you can say snake in a number of different ways, and you still know what you're talking about. And by and large, it's been agreed, I think now pretty widely, that attempts to find proto-language in animals has not been successful. And where people have turned with some more confidence is towards birdsong, because that, at first sight, appears to be much closer to our language than most other vocalizations. But in point of fact, although there are fascinating analogies, of which perhaps the most striking is that when the young birds are learning their songs from their tutors, which are usually the males, and these are the birds which have to learn the song rather than having the innate ability, whereby it's just sort of wired into their brain, so to speak. The result of all this is that, sorry, I've lost my thread. Let me have some wine. Let's have some water and common.
Wine might be better.
I hope we won't be deprived for too long. But, yeah, the point about this is that, first of all, that as young, they show the so-called babbling phase, just as our infants do. And indeed, it's very striking how they experiment with the sounds before they crystallize into the song. But in point of fact, when you look slightly more deeply, these comparisons between birdsong and language are really flimsy and superficial. Not least because although they can rearrange things and you can claim to identify some syntactical structure to that, the reality is it's completely sort of one-dimensional. And most importantly, although indeed the songs are conveying information mostly with regards to mate attraction or repelling of potential competitors, what they never do is redeploy those noises in new contexts, whereby they find a new application. And that again is because birdsong does exactly what it's paid to do, and no more than that. And here, I think we have I'm not the first person to have speculated on this. We have this profoundly, well, maybe it's simple, I don't know. In my view, this profoundly deep question of where on earth language comes from. And Douglas is known to have written on this, and I'm sure some of you have as well. But the point about our language is, although we tend to regard it as a whole series of noises, which are strung together in various sorts of ways. And I should say I'm not a linguist. I don't speak other languages with any facility. So I'm not one to engage with, Chomsky and all these other people. But the point about language is that it is, first of all, it's deeply cognitive. And that's why other animals will not have language, because they don't have this cognitive capacity. And most important of all, at least in my view, and something which I'm fascinated from a historical perspective, is it allows us to engage in counterfactuals. We can think of all the alternatives might be. We can plan in that sort of sense. We can say farewell. And also, nearly all language, I think, though discussed, I don't want to talk that thing in there, that's for sure, is it's haunted by transcendence. Everything we say, in a sense, can hide a whole series of other meanings. And that, again, is not a great surprise. I'm sorry, I keep on drawing attention to my host, but, what this means, of course, and you know as well as I do with regard to Coleridge and people like that, and Wordsworth and others, is that all of this draws on these immensely deep wells of imagination. And these are ones which I think are so fascinating because, of course, what they are limitless. There's, one in a way which is almost certainly true of science as well. There's no end to which we might want to investigate. And the majority, probably, to people today would regard this as a note of despair. Do I have to keep on thinking? Oh, I'm out of nothing. No, I go home. Whereas we, for better or worse, want to know, in a certain sense, why what we knew was not very interesting, and what we now want to articulate actually is potentially interesting. And I'm certainly not going to divert on this area particularly. I remember we had a meeting a couple of years ago. I'm very fascinated, and if you don't know him, I'm recommending the work of Owen Barfield, one of the Inklings, and he had this very interesting ideas about origins of language, but equally linked to the evolution of consciousness. And I'm not for a moment, by the way, saying animals are not conscious. I'm sure they are after a fashion, but they don't have any self-realization or any self-knowledge. But Barfield's approach, I think, is worth looking at, simply because whether it's right or wrong, it is so radically orthogonal to current day thinking that at the worst, it will just be a sort of wake-up call. Just supposing he was right, it doesn't have to be. But it's such a refreshing way of considering, not least in terms of historical perspective, that if you're trying to understand something, even working in the 18th century, you can't possibly get into their minds unless you begin to understand that in some ways their way of consciousness was not our way. It obviously somehow you can read these things and you sort of think you've got an understanding, but projecting yourself back into former societies is an enormous challenge. And you can see where my political agenda is going to go on this very quickly indeed. So, quickly to wrap up, if that's okay. And this is again just to, well, I hope it won't irritate you, but when it all goes wrong, what happens when language fails? And I came across a book where I meet this young man quite frequently at one of the second-hand bookstores by a chap called, I think it was Paul Oppenheimer, and it's a book about the depiction of evil in films. It's called Evil and Demonic. And I'm not a great film buff. I appreciate them after fashion, but I enjoyed the book for various reasons. But he had the most interesting analysis, about halfway through his book, of the Tower of Babel. Now, again, you're a theologian, so you nod at this point on that. Something wasn't like that at all. But I think the common view, man on the street, on the number 2 bus in Cambridge, if they asked him, he'd say, well, it's sort of a bit of folklore, isn't it? It really sort of explains how these different languages and dialects came out. And it involves someone who's pretty angry about these things, but even so. But in point of fact, although, and again, I'm not a biblical scholar, but my reading of this, the actual account in Genesis is extremely terse, and some people would argue it's not actually terribly informative. It was then subject to a whole series of speculations, analysis, commentaries, that sort of thing, by Josephus, and also in the book of Jasher. And effectively, these, in their time, this is more or less sort of beginning of the end of BC, AD, Common Era, if you prefer, I don't mind. The Tower of Babel was an assault on heaven. And in Jasher in particular, I think in Josephus as well, there are these graphic descriptions of archers at the top of the tower firing arrows up into the thing, and the arrows returning covered with blood, whereby they'd actually shot either angels, even God himself. And so what this is telling you about is that one has this immense hubris of humans, that they can take over the universe. They can build something which will allow you to assault heaven. Actually, Tolkien writes about it in a slightly different way, but it's actually in a rather similar sort of fashion to that. And the reason why I find this so fascinating is, of course, that the net result is not just a set of dialects, it's actually chaos. It is where language simply falls apart, where you end up babbling. And those of you who've read C.S. Lewis's That Hideous Strength will remember that bit towards the end, when the thing descends and where that hideous strength being the description of this immense shadow of the Tower of Babel falls over the company there. And their ability to speak and communicate is destroyed. And they basically turn back into animals. They're just gibbering and gabbling and saying nothing of any consequence at all. And I can easily get on my high horse here, and these days, of course, you have to be careful. I don't care less, but people get terribly twitchy about this. But in my view, when we begin to destroy and erode languages, when we, for instance, say that certain words can no longer be used, my view would be, say, what the hell are you talking about? I could perfectly willing to discuss the nature of that word and how it may have had various sorts of cultural resonances, or may in fact be misinterpreted by people. That's absolutely fine. That's what academics do. But this idea that in the end you are restricting your language into a narrower and narrower field ends in disaster. And not least, that's why I think universities have something uniquely important to do, although my view is this is under very serious assault at the moment. You'd expect me to say this, I'm that age and that generation and all the rest of it. But these stories about how we differ from animals, how we have language, and when language is corrupted, including by scientists, who then suddenly stand up on podia to conclude and say, follow the science. And anybody which is sensible would say, what is that person talking about? So I'll stop there. I hope I haven't enraged you beyond belief.
Well, thank you very much.